Welcome to Steele Creek Explorer. I'm your host, Jeremy Stout, and on today's episode, bees and other pollinators. Welcome back. As I mentioned, today's episode is all about pollination and especially pollinators in general. So there are many different ways that pollination can occur, and not all of them even happen from living organisms. There's wind-blown pollination is one way that plants can be pollinated. But by and large, most flowering plants are pollinated with the help of animal friends that will help them pollinate. And there are lots of different animals that can become pollinators, many of which can pollinate accidentally. We're going to find some vertebrate animal pollinators and lots of different kinds of pollinators here in just a few moments. But when you think pollination, there is one group of animals that really should come to mind above all others. And it is a specific group of insects, and it's a specific group of insects that unfortunately have a lot of bad stigma that goes along with them. The group is called the Hymenoptera, but this is better known to you and me as the bees, wasps, and ants. Of course, many of these can sting defensively, and so unfortunately, a lot of them have a pretty bad reputation. But even outside of the sting, there's a lot of misconception about maybe which ones are good and which ones are bad. Specifically, a lot of folks have this notion that, oh, bees are good and wasps are bad. Well, first you have to answer the question of what even is the difference between a bee and a wasp. The answer is not quite as simple as you might think. But more importantly, it's not that one is good and one is bad or anything like that. It's actually that everything has a job to play in nature, even the things that might scare us. So that's true especially of wasps. Let's back it back out. We'll talk about those more in just a moment. When we talk about that group I mentioned, the Hymenoptera, there are something like 17,000 species of bees, wasps, and ants and their relatives just in North America alone. It is one of the most important insect groups in terms of biodiversity, but it's also one of the most important insect groups in terms of the number of ecological roles that those animals fill, meaning the jobs they do in nature are incredibly important to the ecosystem that we call home. They all have a job to play. So that group, the Hymenoptera, we find them as fossils as early back as the Jurassic period. And pretty much as soon as we find the first fossils of flowering plants in the fossil record, that's about the same time that we find some of the first Hymenopterans. This is an insect group that is uniquely tied to the angiosperms, or the flowering plants. And so they come in a lot of different forms. Many of them, as I mentioned, as you already know, might be scary to us. Like I want to be careful with this gal right here so I don't break her. Unfortunately, I've got some specimens from the Nature Center here that are not alive anymore. They've completed their life cycle. We didn't go out and kill them. But this one right here is a particularly impressive specimen. This is the largest native bee or wasp in North America, and it looks terrifying. And I understand if you're afraid of this, and you can especially see this one has her big stinger sticking out right here. But in the case of this animal right here, this is the largest, scariest wasp that you don't have to be afraid of. This is called a cicada killer, and if you're a cicada, then maybe it is something you should be afraid of. But as scary as these are, and they do have a stinger, they don't sting defensively. Their stinger is actually used as part of their reproduction. They have that unique lifestyle where the adult females will go out, they find a cicada, the jar flies of the summer. They'll sting the cicada, which paralyzes it but doesn't kill it. And then they'll lay their egg on or near the cicada. And so when the larva cicada killer hatches, it'll eat its way, through the cicadas that the mama cicada killer has laid out for it. So these are huge and they're large and they do have a stinger, but they don't sting people defensively. Not something you have to be afraid of. You can identify them by their large size, and on their abdomen they have a good deal more brown or black than they do yellow. So that cicada killer sometimes gets confused with this right here. This is another large bee that lives in our area, although it's not native to here. It was introduced here. This right here is called the Eurasian hornet, and it's the only true hornet that you can find in our area. True hornets aren't native to the U.S. There are things we call hornets, things like the bald-faced hornet, which is actually a yellow jacket. It's in a slightly different group. But the Eurasian hornet right here, you can tell it apart from the cicada killer because it has a great deal more orange or yellow on its abdomen than it has black or brown. And these do sting defensively, but they're not as common here as the native cicada killers. They can be found here, but they're not usually terribly common. So there are some other things we might find that are important pollinators. I love these gals right here. This right here is the bumblebee. The bumblebee is the only native social bee that lives in North America. The other bee that's social that we're going to talk about more in a few minutes. They're not native to North America, but the bumblebee is. So the bumblebees get a bad rap. Yeah, they have a stinger, they can sting, although they're usually pretty loath to sting. They're one of the more docile of the stinging groups and very important pollinators. But we'll see a lot of others. As I mentioned, it's not just the hymenopterans. Lots of other insects will pollinate. Lots of invertebrates that aren't insects can pollinate. Even spiders and slugs can pollinate sometimes. And of course, there are vertebrates that pollinate as well. Birds and even some mammals. And I haven't even mentioned the butterflies and moths, another important insect group of pollinators. We'll find all these when we get outside in just a moment. Okay, we don't even have to really leave the front porch of the Nature Center to find pollinators in a wide range of taxonomic groups. So right here we're in our butterfly garden, but there are lots of things you can find here besides butterflies. Right here in and around this butterfly bush, I'm seeing beetles, including June beetles and the non-native Japanese beetles. We've got lepidopterans, we've got butterflies and moths flying around. And we've got many species of hymenopterans, bees, wasps, ants, and their allies all buzzing around. We could even find a vertebrate here. We could find a hummingbird pollinating some of these flowers. So cool. All right, here we go. You might have heard of a wolf in sheep's clothing. Okay, well, this metaphor would be the opposite. This is a sheep in wolf's clothing. This right here might look an awfully lot like a yellow jacket or another kind of bee or wasp, but nope. The eyes will tell you who this is. This right here is actually a fly, totally harmless with no stinger, but it has adapted to look like a bee or wasp, which potentially protects it from predators, especially birds. May fly to some other insect to eat because this one looks like it could hurt. All right, well, here are some hymenopterans that oftentimes get a bad rap. These are paper wasps. They can sting defensively, although they're not nearly as aggressive as a lot of people think they are. This is one of the ones that if you leave them alone, they will almost always leave you alone too. These also have a dual life cycle where they're actually carnivorous as larvae. The hardworking workers, will bring back other insects for the larvae to eat. But as adults, they're nectivorous. They eat nectar from flowers, and so they might actually become pollinators. But if you want to talk about social insects that are also pollinators, let's go introduce you to one that has taken society to an industrial scale. But first, we've got to suit up. Okay, well here we are at the park's apiary. These are our beehives. And so right here you can see the entrance and the exit. This right here, it's a small box, but this is a colony of 50,000 bees or more. We'll take you inside in just a moment. But this right here is the central terminal where they're coming and going. Honeybees will fly up to 4 miles or more away from the hive to collect nectar and also pollen to bring back to the hive. You'll see some of these gals will come back with some yellow sacs on their hind legs. That's pollen that they've collected to bring back to eat for short term. And of course they store nectar in the form of honey for long-term food. So this, of course, this is the European honeybee. This is Apis mellifera. This is a non-native species. We've introduced you to non-native species on this show before and talked about how destructive and bad for the environment they can be. But we've also told you that just because something is non-native doesn't make it bad. So this is a species that, of course, we humans depend on, not for the honey's delicious, but because they are such an important pollinator of many of our food crops. The foods we eat depend on this species. So it is one of the first non-native species to make it to North America. It was brought here with some of the earliest settlers in the 1600s. We know that honeybees were brought as pollinators for plants. But also they create other materials that we depend on as well, including the honey, but also the wax we use for a lot of different purposes. So let's take you inside and see a little bit about the inner workings of the colony. All right, so this setup right here is a pretty standard commercial type or home beekeeping operation. So what you try to achieve with this kind of hive box is twofold. First, you're trying to recreate what nature will do automatically. And that's just a suitable place for the bees to rear young, raise eggs, take care of their queen, but then also, hopefully, also provide adequate space and resources for them to provide a surplus of honey, enough for them to get through the winter, and also hopefully maybe someday enough for you to harvest for yourself. Or commercially if you have lots and lots of hives. So what you have here, you'll notice there are two distinct segments. The bottom is what we started with, and that right there is what's called the brood box or the brood chamber. That's where the queen is most likely to be and all of her associated workers. We fed our bees for some time after we first got them established, this new colony that we started this year. But then after a while, once the bottom brood chamber was full of comb and activity, then we took out the sugar water feeder and replaced it with this right here. This is called a honey super. So ideally, the workers, as they start to bring back nectar, will start to build up and do two things: create comb and then fill that comb with capped honey, which is the stuff that we humans like to get a hold of at the end of the year. Now, this being the first year for this colony, it's unlikely that we'll get any excess honey for ourselves. We're going to leave everything to the bees this year. But possibly if the hive succeeds year after year, then we might be able to take some honey for ourselves. But without further ado, let's go ahead and open this up and show you the inside workings of the hive. So the things that you'll find inside of a hive system like this, these right here are the frames. This is the stuff that is mostly hollow when it's not active. That hopefully what's going to happen is these bees are going to connect the bottom to the top and the two sides with the hexagonal comb that's a set width. and fill this up, and then hopefully fill those cells with honey. But so far it appears that our honey super, which we just put on not terribly long ago, is not, doesn't have a lot of active comb on it yet. To show you what that looks like, we got to go one box deeper. And now, we don't have much business to do in the hives today, so I'm going to try to do this disrupting them as little as possible. But they're still probably going to get pretty agitated. All right, beautiful, beautiful. Take care to not accidentally smush anybody here. So here you can see what these ladies have been up to. Here we've got the hexagonal comb. It appears that we have got some active sugar or honey that's being stored in some of these cells. And it also appears that we might have some brood chambers here. Now, let's see, it'd be unlikely that the first frame we would grab would have a queen in it. But it is possible that if we can find, here we go. Let's take a look here. We do have somebody here that I would like to borrow for a few minutes. All right, so let's go ahead and put these gals and a few guys back to work. All right, now, if you remember, I borrowed 2 friends from the hive. Let's take these outside of the enclosure. We'll take off our protective equipment and we'll get a closer look at these friends. Well, just to demonstrate how bees aren't nearly as scary as many of us think they might be, I am here to demonstrate an experiment with my own son. My helper Elliot here is going to demonstrate something that I think is going to be a lot of fun. So hold out your hand, Elliot. So here we've got a honey stick, and we're going to put just a little dab of honey on his hand here, just to create a sticky, delicious substance. And then if you remember, I actually took 2 bees out of our beehive, 2 honeybees. And here's one right here. So let's see if we can get him to stick to the honey. There we go, buddy. All right. So here I have put, these are one of our European honeybees right here. And this right here, why in the world would I do this to my own son? Well, for several reasons. I'm sure many of you correctly guess that this one right here is a drone. This is a male honeybee. Not to be confused with the workers, which are all females, and those are the ones that can sting. So I was able to find these 2 males right here by their larger size and their darker abdomens. They're not quite as big as queens, but they're bigger than the females. So here he is stuck to Elliot's hand by the honey, but he's also actively going to town on that, getting him a nice treat. But remember, whether you're here to discover honeybees, butterflies, hummingbirds, or any of our other native and non-native plants and pollinators, be sure to visit Steele Creek Park, because here's where you can be the explorer.